UFO in Rendlesham Forest, the unresolved mystery of the military base in 1980. It was December of 1980. It was cold, it was dark, and Rendlesham Forest felt more ominous than usual. I was part of the military staff at the United States Air Force Base in Ventwaters, England. Although the days seemed routine, that night would change my life forever. It was dawn, and I was in the guard room. The clock on the wall read 3:00 a.m., and outside everything was silent, except for the soft hum of the base in operation. I was going through the night reports when the phone rang with a shrill ring that made me jump. "Sergeant," said a voice on the other end of the line. It was Lieutenant Johnson, who was in the watchtower. There was a slight tremor in his voice, something rare for him. "I'm seeing strange lights in the forest. They don't look like planes. No, they don't look like anything I've ever seen before." My eyebrows arched at his words. Lights in the forest. At first I thought he was playing a practical joke, but something in his tone made me think twice. Johnson was a veteran, someone who had served for years and had seen it all. If he said there were strange lights, there had to be something worrying him. "Are you sure, Lieutenant? Couldn't they be car headlights or house lights in the woods?" I asked, trying to find a logical explanation. "No, Sergeant," he replied. "These lights are moving in a way that... No, they're not car headlights or house lights. I'm not sure what they are." The lieutenant's voice was deep and shaky, filled with a tension I had never heard before. In all my time in the Air Force, I had never heard that note of fear in a superior officer's voice. With a deep sigh, I got up from my chair and grabbed my jacket. "I'm on my way, Lieutenant," I said, hanging up the phone. Something was happening in Rendlesham Forest that night. Something that would put to the test everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I quickly gathered a team, and we headed into the forest of Rendlesham. The cold wind cut our faces, and the sounds of the woods kept us on high alert. We went farther and farther in, until we saw what we could not believe. As we moved deeper into the forest, the strange light grew more and more intense. So bright it reflected on the leaves of the trees, making the entire environment take on a bluish, ethereal tone. There was an odd silence, a stillness that seemed to muffle even our heartbeats. Then we saw it. The object was there, suspended in a clearing in the woods. It was metallic, reflecting light in a way I had never seen, like it was made of a metal, not of this world. It was covered in glowing lights, blue, green, and white, blinking in a pattern that seemed random but also, somehow, ordered. The light from these lamps was so intense that we could barely look directly at the object. The shape of the object was bewildering. It wasn't a perfect circle, nor a square, nor any common geometric form I could identify. It was a strange mix between a triangle and a sphere, with angles and curves that seemed to defy logic. Most astonishing was that the object appeared to be floating above the ground. There were no traces of wheels, no legs, no other form of support. It simply hovered. What caught my attention were the inscriptions. Across the entire surface of the object, there were marks, symbols we did not recognize. They didn't resemble any language or code I knew, lines and curves forming complex, abstract patterns. We didn't know what they meant, but instinctively we felt they had great importance. We stood in silence, staring at the unidentified object. Each of us was trying to process what we were seeing, trying to find a reasonable explanation. But at that moment, no explanation seemed adequate. Something impossible was happening before our eyes, and all we could do was watch, astonished and terrified at the same time. There we were, 6 men hardened by military life, paralyzed by the sight in front of us. We stared open-mouthed at the object as it floated effortlessly, its metallic surface gleaming with multicolored lights that flickered in a way that seemed almost hypnotic. Despite the cold of the night, we could feel a heat emanating from it, a kind of energy that seemed beyond our understanding. Every instant we spent before the object seemed to stretch into infinity, as if time itself had been distorted in its presence. Every flicker of its lights, every vibration on its surface seemed synchronized with our heartbeats. We were trapped in a spectacle that felt at once wondrous and terrifying. Suddenly, without warning, the object began to move. First, there was a slight tremor, as if it were coming to life. Then, without the slightest noise or displacement of air, it shot into the sky at a speed that defied comprehension. In the blink of an eye, it went from hanging in front of us to a bright point in the sky, then vanished completely. We all stood stunned, our flashlights still aimed at where the object had been moments before. We felt an emptiness in our stomachs, a sensation of awe and disorientation. We had witnessed something inexplicable, perhaps forever inexplicable. The trees returned to their natural darkness, and the forest returned to its usual silence, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But we knew something had happened, something that had changed us, something we would remember for the rest of our lives. We stayed there for a while, our flashlights pointing at nothing, trying to process what we had just experienced. Then slowly, we began to head back to the base, our footsteps echoing in a forest that now seemed far more mysterious and enigmatic than it had ever been. We could barely contain our excitement and fear as we rushed back to the base. Each of us was still processing what we had witnessed in the forest. We had gone out to investigate strange lights, and we had returned having seen something that transcended our understanding. When we arrived at the base, a cold air of tension greeted us. Our superiors were waiting, their serious faces lit by the moonlight. Colonel Sanders, a tall, thin man with a grey beard, stepped forward. "We've been waiting for your report," he said. His tone was flat, almost mechanical. Without wasting time, we began to recount everything we had experienced, from the lights to the object's shape and descriptions. We talked about how it rose and disappeared without a trace. As we spoke, we expected to see expressions of astonishment, disbelief, or even fear on our superiors' faces. But none of that happened. Instead, Colonel Sanders nodded without showing surprise or wonder. It was as if he already knew what we were going to say, as if he had been expecting our report. When we finished speaking, he simply stood there in silence for a moment, studying our faces. Then, in a firm, decisive voice, he gave his orders. "This does not leave this room," he said. "This incident is not to be discussed. You will not speak of it to anyone outside this team. Understood?" His words left us perplexed. Not talk about what we had seen. Why? What was it they didn't want the world to know? But we were in no position to argue. We nodded in silence, accepting the order. The Render Sham Forest incident became our secret, an experience we could not share with the world. Despite the orders, the experience was seared into our memories, always present, always reminding us there were things in this world beyond our understanding. The mystery behind Room 8, a true account of military life. During the occupation, our base had transformed. The barracks, once filled with laughs and jokes, were now silent and tense. The wings used to be full of activity, with soldiers coming and going, but now many were deserted, except one, Room 8. Room 8 was used for intelligence meetings. It was always locked and guarded. Only those with authorization could enter. As a private, my job was mainly to patrol the base and maintain security. I didn't have access to Room 8, but the stories circulating about it were unsettling. It was said to be used for interrogations, for secret meetings, for planning our strategies, but no one knew for sure. All that was known was that Room 8 was the nerve center of our operations. There I was, standing in the cold, sterile hallway, just outside the mysterious Room 8. I had been given a simple task: guard the room. But it wasn't an easy task. The heavy sealed door of Room 8 seemed like an impenetrable barrier, a wall hiding the secrets of the occupation. The air in the hallway was charged with palpable tension. I could barely make out the murmurs coming from the room, serious voices speaking in hushed tones. I tried to catch fragments of conversation, stray words that might give a clue about what was happening behind that door, but the sound was too muffled. Every now and then, the deep, authoritative voice of the commander cut through the murmur. I couldn't clearly hear what he said, only the firm, decisive tone of his voice. I knew they were discussing important matters, issues that could influence the course of the occupation, perhaps even the outcome of the war. For what felt like hours, I held my post, motionless, my back rigid against the hallway's cold wall. Every noise, every change in the tone of the voices behind the door, put me on alert. I felt a mix of curiosity and fear. I wanted to know what was happening in that room, but I also knew it might be information I wasn't ready to handle. I watched as the door to Room 8 opened slowly, bathing the dark hallway in a dim light. The commander emerged, his imposing presence filling the space. His uniform, always so immaculate, looked worn, and the pronounced circles under his eyes bore witness to a night of difficult decisions. His shoulders were slumped, a posture I had never seen him adopt before. The hard lines of his face were tense, and there was a gravity in his eyes that unsettled me. He seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He looked me in the eyes, and at that moment a chill ran down my spine. There was no warmth in his gaze, only overwhelming fatigue and something else, something I couldn't identify. There was a kind of unspoken understanding in that look, a recognition of the harsh reality of our situation. Without a word, he began to walk down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. I watched his figure fade into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and questions. What had happened in that room? What had worn the commander down so much? At that moment, I realized the gravity of our situation. If the commander, a constant rock amid uncertainty, could be affected like that, the situation must have been truly serious. I became more aware of the silences that fell over the base, of the worried looks exchanged by the high-ranking officers. I began to understand that what happened in Room 8 was far more than simple meetings. Decisions were being made that affected lives, that charted the course of the war. And although I still didn't know exactly what was discussed within those walls, I had learned a valuable lesson. War wasn't made only of shootings and battles in open fields. It was also waged in silent rooms, in decisions made in the dead of night, in whispered words behind closed doors. So each time I passed Room 8, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each shiver was a reminder that I was in the middle of something bigger than myself, that every small task I performed contributed to a broader effort. Even if I couldn't see the whole picture, I knew every piece, even the smallest, was essential. And with that thought, I carried on, day after day, carrying Room 8 and its secrets with me. The end of the USS Scorpion. A survivor recounts the real incident. It was May of 1968, and I was aboard the USS Scorpion, a nuclear submarine of the United States Navy. With 99 men on board, we were in the middle of the Atlantic, sailing in the cold, dark depths of the ocean. Life on a submarine is unlike anything else. You are surrounded by steel, surrounded by water on all sides, completely isolated from the outside world. There are no days or nights, only dim lights, and the constant noise of the machinery. We spoke in whispers, each of us focused on our work, aware that any mistake could be fatal. The last time I saw daylight was when we submerged in the port of Norfolk, Virginia. We were heading on a surveillance mission in the Atlantic. Our days passed routinely, full of equipment checks, status reports, and the constant humidity in the air. The only constant was the steady rhythmic heartbeat of the submarine, a kind of pulse reminding you were alive. On May 22nd, a day forever engraved in my memory, everything changed. I was in the control room, surrounded by blinking indicators, humming monitors, and the ever-present drone of machinery. Life inside the submarine was noisy in its own peculiar, quiet way, until a sudden blow disturbed our calm. Without warning, the submarine shook violently, as if an invisible giant had struck us with a powerful blow. I grabbed the controls to keep my balance. A wave of uncertainty washed over me. Had we collided with something? An iceberg, perhaps? But we were too deep for that. Before I could even process what was happening, the deafening sound of explosions filled the air, one after another in quick succession. It was as if hell itself had broken loose inside the submarine. The lights flickered, throwing the control room into moments of absolute darkness. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. The constant hum of the machinery died out, replaced by the ominous creaking of metal and the distant sound of water pounding against the hull. The submarine began to list to one side. The depth gauges started to spin. The alarms, those damned alarms, began to shriek, piercing the silence with their sharp wails. All around, chaos erupted. Men shouted, tools fell, the lights continued to flicker. I fought to stay on my feet, my mind racing to understand what was happening. But above all, I remember the fear, the raw, paralyzing fear that took hold of all of us as we sank deeper and deeper into the ocean's dark abyss. The last image burned into my mind was that of water rushing in, a relentless torrent forcing its way through every crack and seam, devouring everything in its path. The sound of the water's pressure forcing its way into the submarine mixed with the muffled screams of men and the screeching groan of metal. The water was cold, cruel, unforgiving cold that steals the breath from your lungs. It took hold of my legs first, rising quickly, engulfing everything in its path. It dragged me down, forcing me to fight against its implacable strength. I could feel it stealing the heat from my body, feel how every breath became a struggle. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but the water was too strong, too fast. I could feel it pulling me downward, toward the darkness of the ocean. My vision began to dim. The outlines turned blurry. The lights faded into tiny, distant dots. The pressure in my ears was unbearable, a constant stabbing that increased with every meter we descended, and then everything was darkness. I don't know how much time passed. Seconds, minutes, an eternity. I don't know. I only remember the cold, the sound of the water and the pressure, then only silence and darkness. The next time I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed, wrapped in white sheets and surrounded by bright lights. They told me it was a miracle I was alive, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold. I can still see the darkness, and I wonder if some part of me is still there, in the Atlantic, inside the USS Scorpion. To this day, the fate of the USS Scorpion remains a mystery. Was it an accident, an attack, an equipment failure? I can only speculate. But every time I close my eyes, I can hear the alarms, feel the shudder, see the lights flicker, and I wonder what really happened in the depths of the Atlantic on that fateful May night. This is a fictional account based on a real event. In reality, there were no survivors of the USS Scorpion incident.